From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. When Peter Sullivan was 29 years old, he was jailed for a murder he didn't commit. That was in September 1986, when the world was a very different place.
We still have telephone boxes in the street back then. We don't have them anymore. It's all mobile phones. He doesn't have them now, does he?
He spent the next 38 years, 7 months and 21 days in prison for a crime he'd never committed. 2 weeks ago, that finally changed when he appeared in front of the Court of Appeal.
And so here he is, just on a video link, looking so much older than all the photographs of him at the time of his arrest so many years ago. And what's been described to me is that he was just sitting on the video link from HMP Wakefield, listening to the ruling.
New DNA evidence inevitably weakens each strand of the circumstantial evidence presented.
The moment that Sullivan got the news in the appeal court was kind of extraordinary.
We allow the appeal on ground one. We quash the conviction.
He had his head down and his arms were folded.
The appellant must therefore be released from custody.
I think a lot of people thought that he was crying at that moment and just struggling to take in the enormity of what he's just been told, because that's his entire adult life, really. You know, certainly prime of adult life, wiped out for him in prison.
Peter has asked me to read this message on his behalf. I am not angry. I am not bitter. I am simply anxious to return to my loved ones and family, as I've got to make the most of what is left of the existence I am granted in this world.
Why did it take almost 4 decades to clear his name? The story today, Peter Sullivan and the worst miscarriage of justice in British history.
I'm Emily Dugan, and I'm a reporter at the Sunday Times.
Emily, this is a story about a huge miscarriage of justice, which is a subject you've looked at a lot in your time as a reporter. With this case, I mean, there are 2 victims, really. Take us back to the very first. Tell us about Diane Sindall.
Diane Sindall was 21. She lived in Seacombe on the Wirral in Merseyside. She was a barmaid and a florist, and in lots of ways her adult life was just starting. This was 1986. She was engaged to be married to her childhood sweetheart, and her mum described her as a vivacious, bubbly, happy-go-lucky girl. And obviously, her life was cut horribly short very young. And there's a parallel going along here, because Peter Sullivan's life was also, one could argue, cut short, because such a majority of his adult life was spent in prison.
Take us back to how all of that happened. How did Diane die?
It was August the 1st, 1986. Diane was driving home from a shift at the Wellington pub in Bebington when her van ran out of petrol. Witnesses said they'd seen her walking along the road just after midnight, and I think she was going to try and find some petrol. A taxi driver said that he saw a man and a woman arguing. And then all that we know is that her body is found, and it's found the following morning in an alley. And it's half naked, it's mutilated. She'd been sexually assaulted, she'd been badly beaten. And when her body was examined, it was found that she'd died from a cerebral hemorrhage following multiple blows. So this was an incredibly violent attack. And in the aftermath of that, obviously, the police are under enormous pressure to find a suspect.
So you have this horrific, brutal murder of a woman who just happened to run out of petrol. It's a case that captures the news across the country. What do the police actually do in terms of their investigation?
The murder itself, it really, really shocked the people of Merseyside. And, you had reports in the press at the time calling the killer the Beast of Birkenhead and the Mersey Ripper, and actually the Wolfman because of bite marks that were found on Diane's body.
Oh.
2 weeks after Diane was killed, her jeans and her handbag, along with someone else's suede coat, were found partially burned at Bidston Hill, which is a beauty site around 2 miles from the alley. And police found these witnesses who said they'd seen a small fire and a man running away from it.
Hi. Are you doing okay? 21-year-old Diane Sindall was a florist. Residents of
In the aftermath of the murder, BBC's Crimewatch broadcast a reconstruction about a month later of Diane's death.
2.5 miles away at Bidston Hill that Sunday, 3rd of August, Anne Loven and Jim Foster were exercising their dogs. They noticed someone had started a fire.
A couple call in after that Crimewatch broadcast and say they've seen a man running out of the bushes on the day of the fire. Peter Sullivan was put in a lineup, and neither of them identified him from the lineup. But somehow, he still ends up in the picture.
And at this point, who is Peter Sullivan? Is he just like a random local? How does he end up in that lineup?
So I think one of the reasons that Peter Sullivan comes into the picture is he was someone who was known to the police. He was 29 at the time. He was an unemployed labourer, and he was a sort of petty criminal. But I emphasise petty. He'd been in trouble, but we're not talking serious crimes.
Not serious crimes, but known to the police. So what happens when he's arrested?
When Sullivan was questioned by the police, the thing that is really important to know is that he was someone with limited intelligence. And that's something that, his lawyers have acknowledged, that he himself acknowledges. So in that kind of context, he would be considered vulnerable. If he were arrested today, the way that the police would treat him would be very different. But he was questioned for a very long time without a lawyer. And in that time, he would have been under enormous pressure. And it's certainly the case that he was inclined to say what people wanted to hear.
How does that play out here?
He makes a confession. He says, yeah, it was me. Pretty much as soon as he gets a solicitor, it becomes clear to the solicitor that these confessions aren't worth the paper they're written on and that they were given under duress. Sullivan retracted this confession on September the 25th, and he tells police that he made them up because he couldn't remember his movements at the time. But everything is already in play. As far as the police are concerned, they've got their man, and everything just starts moving onwards and onwards and onwards towards the trial. There was also this bite mark evidence. There were bite marks found on Diane's body, which prosecutors said matched Peter Sullivan's teeth. This is not good science. This has been pretty discredited in recent years. Teeth marks aren't like fingerprints or DNA. It's a very crude way of producing evidence.
At the end of the court case, he's found guilty, he's convicted. How long is the sentence?
So in November 1987, Sullivan was sent to prison for life with a minimum term of 16 years.
Which would have taken him up to 2003. Why was he still in prison in 2025?
This is one of the scandals of miscarriage of justice cases, and it's repeated again and again. And that's, if you insist that you're innocent, it is very hard to be released from prison for a serious crime. And the reason for that is the way our probation system works. In order to be released from prison, you need to prove that you are safe in the community. And in order to prove that you're safe in the community, you need to have admitted to your crimes and done work courses that show that you are trying to change your life. But all of these courses require you to say, yes, my name is Peter Sullivan and I committed rape and murder, and here's what I'm going to do to make myself a better person. But of course, if you haven't done that, no one wants to make a false confession under those circumstances, although sometimes people do just to get out. And that's one of the extraordinary things in this case, is that 38 years went by and he still said, it's not me.
That really is remarkable. And during those 38 years, given that he was persisting with his plea of being innocent. I mean, were there appeals? Were there moments when he might have got justice?
So while Peter was in prison, he was trying to find a way to get this conviction overturned. As forensic science was improving all the time, he and his lawyers really hoped that DNA might provide him with a route towards his release and proving his innocence. So in 2008, he applies to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which is known as the CCRC, to see if they could do any kind of forensic work on his case. And they came back and said that having received some advice from the Forensic Science Service, they thought there was little chance that they would be able to find a DNA profile.
That must have been a real blow. Does he get another opportunity?
Well, because he hadn't yet applied to the Court of Appeal, he then tries directly applying to the Court of Appeal in 2019, but that's rejected. And then in 2021, he tries again with the Criminal Cases Review Commission, this time without a solicitor. He just writes in. And someone at the CCRC looked at the case and thought it might be worth seeing if they could find any new DNA evidence, given the advances in science. And at that point, that is when they found DNA from semen swabs that was from another man. On May the 13th, in the Court of Appeal, his conviction was finally overturned on the basis of this forensic breakthrough.
We allow the appeal on ground one. We quash the conviction.
And Peter Sullivan was released from prison that same day.
Could this have been solved sooner? I mean, with the DNA evidence, for example, has that been available? Has it been possible to do those tests for a while now?
So forensic testing has evolved considerably over the time that he was in prison. But it's certainly the case that the particular method used to overturn his conviction has been available since 2014, and that's DNA 17. That is a new forensic technique developed which makes it easier to separate a male and female mixed profile and be able to analyse the male DNA. It's particularly useful in rape cases. So there's been this 10-year window, at least, where that particular forensic testing would have been available to the CCRC. But even before that, there have been earlier versions of forensic testing that have isolated the male DNA, and those have been around since roughly 2003, although improving all the time and changing. Obviously, with any forensic testing, there is a risk that you destroy the sample in the test. So one could argue that had earlier methods been used that are less effective, they might not have exonerated him and they might have taken away his opportunity to be cleared. But I do think that argument does slightly give everyone a get-out-of-jail-free card, because there were moments when one could argue it would have made sense to look again at this case and to at least try. A case that's really relevant here is Victor Neelan's, and he's someone who was in prison for 17 years for an attempted rape, and that was overturned by a forensic discovery made in 2013. And after that case, which was another where the CCRC had initially rejected it many years earlier, and then finally referred it after the DNA breakthrough, they promised Neelan and his lawyers that they would conduct a trawl for all similar cases where DNA evidence opportunities had been missed. So cases like, for example, Andrew Malkinson's, who spent 17 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit, or Peter Sullivan's. These should have been the sorts of cases that got pulled up by this trawl that they promised to do. The problem is, they never did it.
Emily, this is being talked about as being one of the worst miscarriages of justice in British history. It's not the first that you've reported on. Just run us through some of the other big cases.
Well, there are quite a few cases that share similarities with this one that I've looked into. So I investigated the Andrew Malkinson case working here, and I was looking into the ways in which there were so many missed opportunities there for him to clear his name at an earlier moment.
That was a remarkable miscarriage of justice that you brought to light.
But there are many others that share some of the features of both Malkinson and Sullivan. You've got the Oliver Campbell case, and he was someone who had limited intelligence and was put under enormous pressure to make a confession and ended up serving prison time for murder. And he was cleared by the Court of Appeal last year. And as I mentioned earlier, there's Victor Neelan, who spent 17 years in prison for attempted rape, whose name was cleared by DNA. There are a lot of cases where you look back through their history and you see repeated moments where something might have been done, but it wasn't. And the tragedy of this, of course, is that for these serious offences, the jail time is enormous. And it can mean that bureaucratic inaction has left someone rotting in jail for decades.
One of the bodies that you've already mentioned, the CCRC, they would have been across all of these cases. It's a body you've looked into. What exactly is the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the CCRC?
So they're the only body that has the power to send cases back to the Court of Appeal, and it's their job to investigate miscarriages of justice.
And Emily, you spent a long time looking at Andrew Malkinson's case, another huge miscarriage of justice. The CCRC were found to have been at fault there. I mean, just tell us about the review into what went wrong with that case.
So a barrister called Chris Henley Casey was paid by the CCRC to conduct an independent review into the handling of Malkinson's case. And it was pretty damning. Henley said that the case was just allowed to drift. Nobody got to grips with it. Several different case officers looked at it, and in quite a perfunctory way. Nobody got hold of the original police file, which would have revealed all kinds of flaws in the case. And they didn't realise the significance of DNA breakthroughs that were already happening in his case.
That review found that Andrew Malkinson could have been exonerated 10 years earlier, which is horrifying.
In Sullivan's case, if you look just at the most recent history of it, just at those years before the referral to the Court of Appeal, there was good work done. You know, we should give them credit for that. But they are under siege. You know, their number of applications has gone up hugely as their funding has decreased. So you've got these caseworkers who are just trying to deal with far too many cases, and their opportunity to really find something meaningful that might give them the kind of evidence that means they can refer back to the Court of Appeal, that becomes so much less likely when you're dealing with so many cases at once.
Their hit rate doesn't seem to be huge. I mean, how many of the cases they're presented with do they actually refer back to the appeal courts?
So on average, the referral rate is around 2%. And within that, that actually includes cases that might be bundled together. For example, the post office cases, which were predominantly investigated by journalists and presented to them effectively on a plate after the civil case was concluded. And then you've got other cases as well that one could argue are kind of easy hits. For example, where somebody is convicted of an offence such as drug cultivation, where in fact they were a victim of trafficking. Quite easy hits that one wouldn't imagine were the sorts of work that they were spending a lot of time on. And so the big question is, when you get a case like Sullivan or Malkinson, how much are they doing to really investigate over time? One thing that connects the Sullivan and the Malkinson cases when they were first considered by the CCRC is the person who was head of casework at that time was Karen Kneller. She then became chief executive in 2013. And there have been criticisms of the way that Kneller has led the organisation. You know, some of her colleagues, I understand, describe her as Karen Invisible.
Order. Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Justice Select Committee, at which we will be looking at the work of the Criminal Cases Review Commission.
In April, Karen Kneller gave evidence to the Justice Select Committee, and she was asked about the low rate of referrals and the organisation's remote working, and also its handling of the Malkinson case. And when it comes to remote working, she gave extraordinary evidence.
I'm probably in the office maybe 1 or 2 days every couple of months or so.
1 or 2 days every couple of months?
So we are not an office-based organisation anymore.
1 or 2 days every couple of months. It's extraordinary, and there was a kind of collective intake of breath in the room at that moment. And for work as important as this, it is quite extraordinary that it's become an entirely remote working organisation. During COVID, they took the decision that instead of just saying, this is a temporary thing, we're going to have more meetings on Zoom and eventually we'll all go back, they decided that they'd be able to hire a greater breadth of people and perhaps get people who are more experienced by saying you can base yourself anywhere. But because all those people were hired on those contracts, they can't actually even insist that they go to the office if they wanted to.
That's mad.
Because it's defined as a remote-first organisation. So that means despite having very good offices in Birmingham, nobody's actually in them most of the time. And in fact, if anyone does go to them, they can claim it on expenses. But I guess the other big thing is, if you're working on a case that might have striking similarities to another, and you're sitting next to a case officer who worked in that case, that's when you might have the sorts of conversations that help to push an investigation on.
That is shocking. That's just so bizarre.
One of the other things I found out about Nella's time as chief executive is that her job is also to ensure the good use of public funds. But during her time as chief executive, she has gone on multiple training courses at a very expensive business school in Fontainebleau in France. INSEAD is the business school. And, these courses cost thousands and thousands of pounds and included things like digital disruption. And each time, obviously the CCRC has to foot the cost of the travel to France, staying on the on-campus luxury hotel, as well as the courses themselves. And there's a big question over whether cheaper courses could have been available, perhaps nearer Birmingham.
You appear to have undertaken some training. How did you make the decision as to what training you would have?
So the business school in question.
When Nella was asked about this at the Select Committee, she said the business school in question provided training which was commensurate with the work senior leaders or chief executives do, and was entirely suited to the work I was doing in my role. Karen Nella was later accused of misleading Parliament during the Select Committee meeting. When I was watching her evidence, I knew from previous reporting that it wasn't adding up. I sent Chris Henley a transcript of what Nella told the committee, and he said it was thoroughly misleading. Another man who worked with the CCRC was also unimpressed when I showed him what had been said. He shared his resignation letter with MPs to show that it didn't match what Nella had told them about his departure.
And Emily, the CCRC has actually been discussed by politicians in the last few days in fairly damning terms. Just tell us what the Parliamentary Select Committee had to say.
Since we reported this in the Sunday Times, the Select Committee published a report on Friday, including the evidence we unearthed, and called on Nella to go. In the report, the Justice Committee said that the CCRC had shown a remarkable inability to learn from its own mistakes. And that's why Andy Slaughter MP, who chairs the committee, said, "We no longer feel that it's tenable for Nella to continue as chief executive of the CCRC." He said the CCRC requires root and branch reform.
And Emily, what do the CCRC have to say for themselves?
In terms of the allegations that Nella misled Parliament, that's still currently being investigated. I emailed both Karen Nella and the CCRC. The CCRC came back to me and did point out some more nuance in Nella's answers later in the evidence session. A CCRC spokesperson said it noted the committee's recommendations and that the organisation is committed to finding, investigating and referring potential miscarriages of justice. The CCRC made it really clear that they have made an undertaking to implement the recommendations that Henley made in the review of its handling of the Malkinson case. And they really have implemented a massive task in trawling through for old forensic cases. And they've got more funding from the Ministry of Justice to do that. It's still in relatively early stages. I mean, I'm not sure that they've begun any testing yet, but they are filtering through the cases. One of the things that actually will still remain to be seen is whether that review extends to cases beyond rape and murder. Because as has been shown in some other cases I've investigated, the consequences for people's lives, even for lesser crimes, can be enormous.
If you're looking at other factors that unite some of the great miscarriages of justice, there's also the role of the police. Tell us about their role in the Sullivan case.
Well, of course, crucial to his initial conviction is the police work that led to it. And we know that the way the police conducted those interviews forced him into a false confession. A colleague of mine at the Times, David Brown, was looking into one of the detectives working on his case, Detective Superintendent Thomas Baxter. Now, he led the Sullivan investigation with another detective. And at the time of Diane's death and Peter's arrest in 1987, he was deputy head of the whole of Merseyside's crime investigation department. Baxter was also involved in another potential miscarriage of justice case. He was the senior officer in the Eddie Guilfoyle case, and that's where a husband was convicted of the murder of his pregnant wife, who died by hanging. Guilfoyle has always insisted on his innocence, and one of the features of that case was the way that evidence was hidden from view. In particular, a diary of Guilfoyle's wife, which revealed that she was suicidal. When the Times asked him about this in 2016, Baxter said, "I've got no recollection of it, so I can't really comment." This month, when asked to discuss the cases, Baxter said, "I'm not interested, thank you."
And what about Peter Sullivan himself? How does he restart life now, 38 years on?
Well, he's a very private man, and I think he has his own challenges in his life already. His interaction with ordinary life after 38 years incarcerated is going to be very, very hard. Life as we know it is so different to what he experienced before he went in. His brother told Channel 4 News that they still had telephone boxes on the street when he went into prison. How he's going to make sense of modern life is going to be pretty tough, I think. The other big question is what compensation he might be paid. So it's not automatic that victims of miscarriages of justice get paid compensation at all. In fact, it's quite common that they don't. Very few do. And they have to prove their innocence beyond reasonable doubt to be eligible for it. Now, Sullivan should be in that position because there's a forensic breakthrough, but there are others, such as Victor Neelan. Victor Neelan had a forensic breakthrough. He's never been paid compensation.
Really?
So there's every chance that under the current system, Sullivan doesn't even get any money at all. If he does turn out to be eligible for compensation, that is actually capped at £1 million. It's an amount that was set a very long time ago. So it was set as an arbitrary figure rather than something that would change with inflation. And, for someone like Sullivan, that works out as just over £26,000 for every year he was in prison. It's quite hard to see how that could compensate someone for that level of life lost. Peter Sullivan's sister said, "Peter hasn't won, and neither has the Sindall family."
They've lost their daughter. They're not going to get her back.
Emily, at the end of all of that, after 38 years of the wrong man, Peter Sullivan, being in prison, the other question is, who did actually kill Diane Sindall? Presumably her killer might still be at large.
Exactly. Merseyside police say they're committed to doing everything in their power to find who the DNA belongs to. And one of the frightening things about this breakthrough is, yes, they know that it's another man's DNA, but it's not someone who's been matched on the DNA database. So they're basically back to square one. There's a charity working with sexual assault victims that was set up in Diane's memory. And several people told that charity in the intervening years that the police had arrested the wrong person. Nobody would name names. And I guess the challenge for the police now is going back to this very historic case and seeing if they can persuade anyone to give them new information.
And for Diane's family, nearly 4 decades on, still no sense of justice. What have they said? What do they make of what's happened?
Diane's family haven't made a public statement yet. So we don't know exactly what they're feeling. We don't even know how many of her close relatives have survived, because it's been so long. But the memorial stone at the place where she died reads, "Diane Sindall, murdered August 2nd, 1986, because she was a woman. In memory of all our sisters who have been raped and murdered. We will never let it be forgotten."
That was Emily Dugan, special correspondent for the Sunday Times. You can read more about the Peter Sullivan case and all the latest on the CCRC at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producers today were Hannah Varrall and Shabnam Grewal. The executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.